All right. So today I'll be talking about LSP and showing you how it works. Um, if you didn't watch the last video I did, basically I showed you how you could convert your terminal to an IDE using Neovim plugins. I'll be dropping the video somewhere around here so you can go watch again. All right. But in the video I talked about the Neovim plugins I use, and one of the plugins I also mentioned was LSP, but I felt like I didn't give it enough justice, and that is why we are doing this video, so I can briefly explain LSP, what it is, why we use it, and how it works. All right. So LSP was designed by Microsoft in collaboration with CodeMV and Red Hat for Visual Studio Code. All right. I think currently it is open sourced, but actively still maintained by Microsoft and Visual Studio Code. Now, for me to better explain, or for you to have a good understanding of how it works, I'm going to take you back to say 6-7 years ago, right? When and this was before LSP, right? So 6-7 years ago, if you needed to say maybe write a programming language in C# or a programming language in Java, for instance, you first of all needed to install Visual Studio for C#, right, or NetBeans for Java, or say Python for PyCharm, for Python, or Swift. You needed to have like an VSCode, or for Android development, you needed to have like an Android Studio. Yeah. So for every programming language, then we had language-specific editors, right? And fast forward to when we then had Visual Studio released, right? So if you first of all install Visual Studio, what you have is just a bare IDE with not too many functionality or capability, but one thing it has then was, or one thing it has, right, is an extension manager where you're able to install extensions, right? And I think that takes us back to LSP. All right. So LSP, like I mentioned, is a language server protocol that sits between your IDE and your language servers, and basically undoes the communications that flows between them. All right. So I have this diagram that basically just shows you how it works. And as you can see, we have our LSP here, and in between the we have it sitting in between the client, which is an IDE. In this case, we call it the client, and then the language server. All right. So when you install your Visual Studio, right, you go to your extension. You're able to install based on your preference. You're able to install your language servers, meaning Visual Studio Code is able to support as many programming languages as possible. That is only possible with the use of the LSP, right? So the way it works, right, is the client, in this case Visual Studio Code, communicates to our TS server. And how does that communication works? So say for instance you open a JavaScript or a TypeScript file, and you type in the word, you type in the word console, or con, right? So a request is sent via the LSP to the TypeScript server. Then the TypeScript server return a response, and what you would see, right, in your Visual Studio Code is console or const as an option, and then you can choose in between which one you want to use based on your use case, right? So basically that's how LSP works. It helps with code suggestion, code completion, go to definition, renaming, syntax highlighting, and you're able to also help with code formatting and viewing diagnostics or errors. All right. So basically what happens is the way it works, or the way it's being managed, is for every file you create, it has an extension, right? Because the question would now be, okay, how does the LSP knows which server to talk to, All right. So it uses the file extension. So you see we have .ts for TypeScript, JS for JavaScript, Go for Go project, and RS for Rust project. All right. So based on the file extension, it goes to the respective language server. All right. So we have our TS server for TypeScript, we have Go Please for Go, Rust Analyzer for Rust, and Rostlint for C#. In Visual Studio, this is already installed when you install the language support from your extension. All right. Now in the terminal, okay, let me see. All right. So in the terminal, it's basically the same thing. All right. So this is a Rust project, and I'm just going to show you how the LSP also works in the Neovim project. Right. So this here is an app which is a struct, right? So to be able to view the definition, right, we have the LSP already installed, and here we can see we have the go to definition, go to declaration, go to implementation. All this is with the support of LSP. And then if I type D, you see I already have that's taking me to the definition, and I can see where the app struct is being defined. Right. So that's one of the functionality of the LSP. Right. Another one is the code suggestion. So let's say there's a mistake with the code, right? The LSP also helps by highlighting the errors, and it also suggests. So if I have the array, I can see the options that basically help fix the issue that is being highlighted. Yeah. Yeah, so that's basically how LSP works. All right. And that is why we're able to have IDs like VSCode, Sublime Tests, or even terminals, right? With support of Neovim, work with multiple languages, and we're able to do good stuff, right? I mean, I hope this explanation is clear, but you can also drop a comment if you still need more explanation or you need me to talk more about it. All right. Then I'll see you in the next video. Also do well to like, subscribe, and follow. All right. And yeah, I guess that's all for this week. Cheers. Chill with me on my stroll up in software.